Hello and welcome back to Strathpeffer Junction. This is part 2 of the series of installing a ESU LokSound version 4 Micro and stay alive capacity with the ESU PowerPack Mini into Class 08 Shunter by Bachmann. It's quite a long project, it's taken a few hours, so we split it into 2 parts. So if you haven't seen part 1, please do check that out. But if you've seen part 1 and you're ready to get stuck into part 2, please stick around and I very much hope you enjoy it. So now that we have the wires routed through into the main body from the cab, and we have the cab back on again, it's time to put the weight back on. Now last time I did that right now, and I was about to do that right now, but what I noticed this time is one of the wires for the negative side of the cab LED is actually really short. It's short because it snapped when I was testing it. So ordinarily I think you get away with replacing the weight just now and soldering afterwards. What I'm going to do first on this occasion though is to solder on, well I was going to say a slight extension of wire, but actually I'll just solder on the resistor for the cab light. Because I'll have enough play to be able to do that, and then I shall put the weight into place. But as I say, ordinarily you can probably put the weight back in and then do all the soldering at that next stage. So I shall get the soldering equipment together now, and we will solder on the extension, or not the extension, rather the resistor to the cab light. I'm going to use a 10k resistor. That's quite a high resistance resistor, but really we want to have a really dim light, as dim as possible, and I haven't been able to use successfully the chips or the decoder to get just quite the amount of brightness that I'm after. So we're going to use the resistor, as I say, 10k to achieve something along those lines. The common method is to use a helping hand, but I actually find that helping hands are not always that helpful when you're soldering these tiny little bits of wire. The teeth on them just don't grip them enough. What I tend to find works quite well actually is just to use a little bit of BlackTak just to hold the components in place. So what I'm going to do is apply some flux, if I can get this open. There we go. A little bit, it's been a while since I used this bottle of flux, but anyway, I'm going to apply a tiny bit of liquid flux to both the end of the resistor and the end of the wire from the LED. To anyone who's watched any type of model railway how-to video, it's pretty obvious why we need to do that, but it enables the tin to flow, or the solder to flow a little bit better onto the cable when we do it. So, I'm just using some very thin, I can't remember what it is, 0.5 mil solder for this. And I'm just going to tin the very end, better do it on the right one, tin the very end of the conductor, there we are, from the LED, and we'll do the same on the resistor as well here. Just tin the very end of it. Doesn't need to be much at all, that's all. Sorry, I'm left-handed and I've got the soldering iron on the wrong side. So right, okay, so we'll just line these two up now that we've tinned them. So the other good thing about BlackTak is that it tends to hold them exactly where you want them. Now I'll be putting a little bit of heat shrink over the top of this anyway, so it doesn't matter if it doesn't look 100% neat. Now I like to just blob a little bit more liquid flux on top of the proposed joint, just like that, just to really help, particularly with these very small cables, or wires, just to help the solder flow and make a strong joint. But it's not absolutely necessary to do that. I also like to start with a nice clean tip as well when I'm doing this. So all I do is just apply a little bit there. Put a wee bit more on there. There we go. Spot on. And that's it, done. Okay, so I've decided just to jump ahead actually and extend the wire for the LED while I'm at it. I've got all my soldering stuff out, so I may as well just do that at this point in time. It'll make it easier. So I've just chosen green, just one of the auxiliary colours. I may at some point put tail and forward lights on this, so I'll leave the yellow and white for those. But anyway, just a wee pre-tinned, and on we go. Easy as that. I'll now put a wee bit of heat shrink tubing on it, which I've got here. I just use a soldering iron for a tiny wee thing like this, just to shrink the tube. But you could use a lighter if you're careful, or you could use a hot air iron as well, or hot air gun for the same thing. And there we have it. Just a little bit of heat shrink tubing there, just to cover over the bare wire and avoid any shorts. So one of the things that I'm going to do now, just before we move on any further, is to drill out a small hole just in the chimney or the exhaust stack at the front of the shunter. That's just to help some of the sound to get out from the chassis in due course. I did it on the previous conversion I carried out to my other 08 shunter, and it worked really well. So I will take a 2mm drill bit, something like that, and drill it out. But I drill it out from the inside, and the reason I do that is just to make sure that I don't damage any of the paintwork. If you're going in from this side here, it'd be very easy to slip and chew up the paintwork or some of the detailing. So if you look for the centre and drill from this side out very carefully to create a hole, then that will be ideal for letting some of the sound out. I'll do that off camera though, because it is finicky and I want to concentrate on getting the hole right rather than my presentation for the video. So I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to having a look at the LokSound decoder and preparing the wires and getting them ready for soldering onto the various components in the locomotive and the cab light and so on. So I bought the 8-pin variety of LokSound, the LokSound Micro, simply because I don't need this. I can cut it off, but it leaves a good length of wire which I can use to hook up the various bits and pieces. I also don't need the speaker either, so what I'll do first of all with the speaker is just to snip the wires off here. We're going to use, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, a much smaller sugar cube type speaker. So I'll just pop that out of the way. And here as well, as I mentioned, the socket has no use, so we'll just snip that off. Always daunting doing that bit, just in case you made a mistake. But anyway, so we'll pop them to the side. So what we have here then is the two speaker wires. We have an auxiliary purple, we've got an auxiliary green, which is the one I use for the cab lights. We've got the red and black wires, which are for the pickups. We've got the grey and the orange for the motor, and then we've got the lights and then the common as well. So I'm going to start preparing all of these just in normal fashion, stripping back a little bit of the outer sheath, tinning all the ends of the wires so that we're ready to go. The other thing to mention as well, actually, just before I do that, is the Stay Alive capacitor setup needs to be soldered onto tiny little tabs on the board here. Now the instructions that came with it show where the tabs should be. So in order to do that, we need to cut away a tiny bit of the plastic that's surrounding that so we can access the tabs. It does say on the LokSound instructions that you can do that without voiding the warranty, because it's the only way to get them. But you need to be really careful, because these wires are very fine and the tolerances there are very slight, so it's very easy to slip. But anyway, I'll go and cut those away, and then I'll prepare all the bits for tinning as well as the wee pads as well. Okay, just a little bit of an update there. I don't know how well this is going to show up, but the pads that we need to access is the blue pad here, the blue wire pad. So I've stripped back the plastic just there to show that. And then on the reverse side, we need these two pads here, 1 and 2. So we need to strip back carefully the plastic there. I do stress, really take your time over it. I used an exacto knife and some mini snips, but even then it is quite fiddly stuff. And you don't want to be scoring the PCB either. because some of the copper tracks in there are very thin, and if the X-Acto knife goes through and cuts a track, well, that's game over for the circuit board. So anyway, those are stripped back now. What I'll do is I'll tin those, as I mentioned before, and tin the end of the wires. I'll do that off camera because it's finicky work. But again, using my BlackTak combination and as steady a hand as I can muster, I'll get the various bits of tinning done, and then hopefully be in a position to solder on some wires in due course. Okay, so now comes the tricky part. It's going to be hard to capture this on the camera, but I'll try my very best to do that. Soldering the stay alive capacitor onto the LokSound itself. We're talking about, if a millimetre, maybe half a millimetre in width. So I use a tiny little dab of flux on there. I've already tinned the pad, so we're all good to go with that. So just make sure it's all lined up and held in place. And then we'll just use the clean tip on the iron. A little bit of solder here. That is pretty much it. There we go, that's a good solid joint there. So I will position the next wire and we'll come back in a second. Okay, so I'm just getting this lined up. I think tiny bit of solder on there. And I think that's pretty much us there. Brilliant, so that's those two on. Now we need to flip it over and we'll do the final one on the other side. Okay, so that's me lined things up here again. It's going to be very hard for you to see, but I have lined it up. It's tricky here because we've already got the blue wire which we need to keep on the same pad. But I've lined the two up, they're all BlackTak in place. Again, I'm going to take a tiny little bit of flux, and really just a tiny bit. You don't want it swimming all over, otherwise it will flow the flux to places you don't want it to go. And again, we'll take a tiny dab on the end of the soldering iron. And that's it. So those are the three trickiest soldering joints on this project, done and dusted. As long as you've got a steady hand, they're not too bad, but do take your time. Right, okay, moving on to the next bit. Okay, now before I go too much further, I'm going to take a little bit of Kapton tape and I'm going to wrap that around the decoder just to replace the plastic that we had to cut off to access those different terminals. Now, using this is much better than insulation tape. Insulation tape, sometimes it depends on the quality of tape, but sometimes the actual sticky glue part has been known to break down and actually become conductive, so it's not particularly great. So what we need to do anyway is just to wrap it around the bits that we've exposed, and it will also create a little bit of strain relief as well for the wires, because there's not a huge amount of room to play with inside this loco body, so sometimes the wires can get just a little bit squashed. So anyway, that's looking good. So now on to fixing up the rest of the wires. Actually, having said on to the next bit, what I just want to do quickly is tape up and insulate any of the wires that we're not going to be using. So we need the blue as the common, we need the green for the auxiliary, we don't need the purple auxiliary, and we don't need the white and the yellow either just now. So if we can route these round to the back, what I'll do is I will insulate each of these on their own, and then just tape them onto the back of the decoder so they're out of the way. They're not going to short out on anything, not going to create any problems for us. This is almost as fiddly as soldering the actual wires on in the first place. There we go, so that's a good bunch. Get a bit of Kapton tape there. And there we have it. So that's those auxiliaries out the road, taped up and isolated. Okay, so I think what I'll do next is to connect up the wires for the cab lighting to the auxiliary and common channels on the decoder. The eagle-eyed amongst you, if you can make it out there, might notice that I've actually taken off the green wire that I soldered on previously. I realised that I had enough length of wire on the decoder wires to not have all the extra flapping about inside. So I've taken that off. I have lined the two up again here, ready to solder together. I've applied some liquid flux. I've also, and this is important to remember because this is the second take and I forgot to do it first time, put your heat shrink on first so that you can run it over the solder joint at a later date. So let's just apply that now. Just well ambidextrous. There we go, that's a good joint. And I'll just shoot the heat shrink over it, shrink it up, and then move on to the next one. Okay, so I have applied the heat shrink, ready to shrink. I've got the two ends tinned here lined up. I have got some liquid flux on it. I should just clean the end of my soldering iron. And let's get that joint soldered. So I'll just slide this heat shrink back over onto the top of that, and then we can move on to the actual motor and pickups. Okay, now we haven't seen the motor and chassis section of the Loco for a wee while now, but we're ready to strip it down, to take out the components, back to really just the base wires, pickup wires. While I've been shooting the video so far, this has been running in. It's quite an old Loco. It runs all right. There's a very slight wobble to it, but it's not too bad. It's definitely one which I think will work fine with DCC. It's not that problematic. I think I've had quite a lot of these 08 shunters, and it can be quite hard to get ones that don't have a wobble. But anyway, this one's all right. So I'm going to strip these end components off now. It's just a couple of little screws to take out. There's one. There's two, second one at the bottom there. And that will, I think, release the circuit board. Just about, yeah. So, well, actually, it looks like we can remove this plug. Actually, do you know what? It doesn't matter because we're not going to be using any of this anyway. So what I will do is I should just cut these back a little bit just to make reuse of the plug easier. And I shall cut these right back here as well. On this particular model, there's not any other capacitors anywhere. They were just on the PCB, but on some of them you'll find that there's capacitors that are linking over different aspects of the motor assembly, so you may need to take all those off as well. What you really want for a DCC installation is no capacitors, no chokes or anything like that on it, just the wires to the motor and the wires from the pickups. So I'll clean these wires up and then get ready to solder them onto the decoder. Okay, so what I'm going to do just now, before we go any further, is to install the weights back in. We've got all the soldering work done that requires access into this central part. So we can now put these cables, wires back in. So it's just a case of lining everything up again like that, and then sliding it in, and then just using something like a screwdriver or a cocktail stick or something like that just to line the cables up there. Make sure they're not pinched anywhere. Slight pinching at the top here. There we go. Don't know you can see in there now. So they're routed through the hole, down the back of the weight, under the weight, and back out again. So that's the weight in there. It's not pinching on anything. So we'll pop the screw back in to hold it all together. I find it quite useful to have a wee set of pliers for this kind of work. There we go. So far, so good. Okay, now I said that I was about to go and prepare the wires and connect the motor, but having had a look at this older model has really two quite prominent sections here for screwing in the retaining screws for the PCB. Now, I think it's going to be best to grind these out, just to create a little bit more room here to fit in the speaker and the decoder. There might be just enough room like that, but I'm a little bit worried, particularly with this lower one, that something could get compressed against it and we could get a short against the chassis. So I'm going to get my Dremel and I'm going to just flush cut off these two sort of screw lugs here. Now I'll have to do that up in the workshop, so I'm not going to do it on camera, but one thing, as with the filing earlier, to be very careful is to keep any iron filings out from the motor assembly and the magnets in there. So what I'll do is I'll mask off this area here so that nothing can come back the way, and then carefully dust it down and give it a little wash with isopropyl alcohol. Okay, so that's me back from the workshop now. As you can hopefully see, I've ground off the two mounting lugs either side there. I used the grinding wheel just to smooth it down as well. It's taking some of the paint off, but it really doesn't matter. So that's created really quite a nice section there, which will enable us to get our speaker in and provide just about enough room to get the LokSound chip in as well, standing up and down. It's pretty tight, but I've done it before, so I'm sure we'll manage it this time. Just as a wee reminder, I got this one from YouTube online. It's their Limo or Limo 6 speaker. It's a wee sugar cube speaker, so smaller than the normal sugar cube, but it gives a really nice, decent sound. And surprisingly bassy actually for the size of the speaker. So with the Limo speaker here, it comes pre-glued together. So some of these sugar cube speakers, the sound box and the actual speaker assembly itself need to be stuck together, but this one here is already stuck together, so it's ready to go. So this is, I think, yeah, it's an 8 ohm speaker, so it will work with LokSound version 4s, and also I think it probably work with Hornby TTS as well, decoders. Because we're just putting one speaker in, it doesn't matter which way around the wee solder tags here are connected. If you were putting them in parallel or in series, you would need to make sure that the polarity was correct on them. But for our purposes, we'll get these tinned up, we'll get them connected to the brown speaker wires on the decoder, and then, well, we'll be very close to getting some movement and some sound, I think. So that's the next step, soldering. So again, I start with some liquid flux. This stuff is called Topnik TK83. It's absolutely excellent stuff. Comes in a wee bottle. The one thing that I would mention is that the bottle is really unstable, and I have, despite my best attempts, I have knocked it over once before, lost about half of the flux, and it is incredibly sticky. It took me ages of scrubbing away on the countertop to get rid of it. So do be careful to always replace the top on this, or maybe even decant it into something better, or create a wee base for it, with 3D printer wood, something like that. Anyway, so pop that to one side. But so I have pre-tinned these connectors as well. I can't remember if I mentioned that already. I think I'll just cut them down to size a wee bit excessive in length. There's always the issue, of course, I don't know if anyone else finds it, but on these little wires, it tends to be, as soon as you apply heat to them, then you start to rapidly lose the protective covering on them. Right, so just apply a tiny wee dot there, and I pop some over there as well. That's a wee bit too much there actually, but not to what I'm sure. will survive. This one will just hold it in place and give it a wee... There we go, that's a good joint on that one. And I'll probably just horse on and get the other one done as well while we're at it. Maybe a tiny wee bit more fresh shoulders on that side there. There we go, excellent. So now what I'll do is I'll just let that cool down. I will just with the side cutters nip off the little raggedy bit there, and then I'll insulate the speaker and the cables, or the wires rather, in Kapton tape. It doesn't really affect the sound at all, but it just ensures that none of that speaker at all will short out on the chassis of the Loco. Okay, so I've got a wee bit of Kapton tape here. I'm just going to pop that to start off with just underneath the conductors. What am I saying, conductors? The tabs, there we go. And we'll just wrap that around the back there. Now that just ensures that none of this section here of the speaker will short on anything. Okay, right, so now moving on to the wiring up of the motor and the pickups to the chip. So the last four wires that we have here are the red and black, which is for the pickups, and the orange and grey, which is for the motor. So I prepared all of these, and I prepared all of these, so I've stripped them back and I've tinned them, so we're pretty much ready to go. So black to black, red to brown. You often find brown represents live or positive, and then the same with the other one. So these are the pickups, these are the motor. So we'll do black to black, red to brown, and I'll set that up and we'll get cracking in just a minute. Okay, so I think I'll probably just try and wing this one by holding it, because it's going to be a bit tricky to solder on the parts while the BlackTak's in place. So we'll just dab on the solder. And there we go, that's a good joint, that's solid. So I'll do the other three and then I shall cover up the heat shrink and we'll be almost ready to go. Okay, so we've got all of the wires connected up now to the motor. We have the speaker connected, we have the cab light connected. I have taken it to my little test track, which is off camera just now, and I'm very pleased to say that it all works first time. I have also tweaked the CV values just to make sure that the PowerPack is working fine. The CVs that I've changed are CV 315. Now that should be set to 0. It was actually set to 0 as a default on the chip that I got here, but on a previous chip I had to change it to 0. And then the second CV is CV 113. Now that's effectively how long the stay alive circuitry will keep the locomotive staying alive. So I've set it to 250. Now that worked quite well on the other Class 08 that I did. I think it can go up to 255 as a maximum. I felt that much less than 200 really wasn't any point at all, but 250 got it across Inchel Frog points absolutely fine, no problems. So those are the CV values that I'll stick with just now to see how we get on. But once I've had it running on the track for a wee bit, I might tweak them. Anyway, now back to the locomotive, and we're almost there. We're within touching distance. Okay, so I've started putting the wires into the various spaces to get them fitting in. This is where the jiggery pokery really starts. As you'll see, I've lined up the speaker just on the front there, almost like the front bulkhead, or if you will. And then there's just enough space in there for the micro. Now, you do need to jigger it about a little bit as you're putting it back together. I've used a little bit of Kapton tape on either side just to keep the motor wires out of the way. but I shall now attempt to pop this back on, and fingers crossed everything will sneak into position. Okay, so there is a bit of an act to this, and I've taken a few attempts off camera to try and find it. There's a hook in the front there which you have to get the cab down, and then you just have to very slowly ease it back down. It's a very tight fit, but it should just about get there with a little bit of gentle persuasion. There we go. Excellent. So I'll tighten up the screws, I'll get everything back to how it should be, and then we'll give it a little test and just double check that having put the lid on, it hasn't shorted something out or something has come disconnected. Okay, I almost forgot, need to put the screw back in again. So I shall just get, there we are, out of the wee, I'll use my wee forceps here. I will just get out the screw. Now this screw is the solitary screw that needed to come out, and it goes in just below where the NEM pocket goes on the back there. So again, it's just a wee Phillips head, screw it back in there. There we go. And that's it, nice and snug. So let's pop the NEM pocket back in again there. And there we have it, complete. So right back at the head of the video, I mentioned when I was taking off the couplers that I wouldn't be putting them back on again. And that's because I don't use tension lock couplers, I use KD couplers. Most of you will know what KD couplers are, you'll have heard of them, and many of you may even use them. I've got a selection here which I use on my rolling stock, but the ones that I'm going to go for this one, which are the ones that I use in my other class 08, are number 20s, the KD NEM number 20s. Now these are the longest ones they do, and I find that most of the locos that I have either use 19 or 20s just because of the buffers and getting a good distance to prevent buffer lock and so on. But anyway, if you haven't used them before, they're dead simple as long as you've got an M pocket. They just pop in like a tension lock coupler, like so. Pop one in at the other side, like so. And there you have it. Now the beauty of the Bachmann Class 08, and actually many of their more recent locomotives, maybe the last 10 years, those that have NEM pockets, is that the NEM pockets in these tend to be at the right height. So these ones are fine. So if we bring along our little KD gauge here and we pop it in there, bearing in mind, there we go, that they're not on the rails, so there's a wee bit of a mismatch, but the height is exactly right for that, so that'll work fine. And the same is true for the one on the back as well. But the problem that we do encounter often with KDs is that European and British rolling stock often don't have NEM pockets, or if they do, the older ones, they would be at the wrong height. So it can be a bit of a minefield using KDs with some rolling stock. But I've devised quite a few workarounds for the different types of rolling stock that I have, and I will be making some videos on these in due course. But anyway, for now, this was a simple KD install. Okay, so you join me now over at the test track. That's all of the hard work out the way, and all that remains to be seen is whether it all works. So we're going to run the shunter through its paces. We'll have a little look at movement to make sure that all the motor is working fine. We'll have a little look at the sound as well to see how that's performing, and then we'll also look at the dead spots around the frog. So these aren't electro frog points that Pico make, these are Hornby's standard points which have an inshell frog. So there's often a dead spot around that which these small shunters in particular can struggle with. So this one used to struggle big time on these types of points. It just wouldn't make them across at anything other than very fast speeds, and even then it was jittery. So let's have a look to see what the movement's like and whether we've cured that. Okay, so we'll leave the sound off for now and we'll just have a little look about performance, about movement. So there we go, I'll just pop it out the side of the frame, relatively slow speeds. And then the hand of God comes in here. and we'll move forward. And this time what I'm going to do is really crawl across the points at just a couple of speed steps, nothing too fast, and fingers crossed we make it across without any stuttering and without any stalling. So it's looking good so far. Prior to installing this decoder, there is absolutely no way that this shunter would make it across at this sort of speed. None at all. So I'm really very happy with that. Let's knock it down to just about as slow as we can get it. Hopefully we'll get across here. I'm very impressed with the performance actually. It really is moving pretty well indeed. There's not so much as a stutter there really. Slight wobble, but the wobble was there before. So what we'll now do is we'll have a look at the sound. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, it's a Legoman ESU LokSound 4. So that starts with press of function 1 on the controller. So that's us started up. It's all sounding pretty good. And let's have a little bit of movement with sound as well. So I'll just pause it there because we've probably got a suitable backdrop just to check the cab light. Now the way the cab light is set up on this chip, it only comes on when the shunter isn't moving, which is relatively prototypical. So we'll just pop it on with function 19. Right, so I'm not actually sure whether you're going to see that or not. It's very faint, which is what we'd intended anyway with a 10k resistor. But I can assure you it's on anyway. But as we move forward, it will pop itself off. So we'll just bring it forward to the middle of the shot there. Now what I'm going to do here is just demonstrate the stay alive capacity with the sound on. So I expect it'll probably be somewhere in the region of about 2 to 3 seconds, which isn't a huge amount of time, but it's what we need to get across the non-electro frog points. So that wasn't too bad at all there. So what I'll do now is, we'll start it up, we'll move it, and we'll see how long we can get movement with the sound on and the motor turning. So I'll wait until we've got a bit of movement and then I'll lift it off the track. So there we have it, finally we've reached the end of the video. It's been quite a long one, so it's been split into parts to make it easier to follow. But I think it's been worth it. I was very keen to do a step-by-step tutorial, taking people from the very start to the very finish of a fairly tricky sound installation like this one required for the Bachmann Class 08. Sometimes I've seen guides in magazines and other places that have shown you various steps but have perhaps glossed over some points or not covered everything. So I wanted it to be fairly in-depth because it is something most people with a bit of time and care could do themselves if they wanted to as a little project. So I'm just going to finish anyway, just with a shot of the shunter. We've seen it working. It's going to look great, I think, on the layout alongside my other departmental stock. And the main thing, I guess, is I'm happy with it. So that's what the modelling hobby is all about. As long as you're happy with what you're producing and that you're getting enjoyment out of it, that's the main thing. So anyway, I'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much for staying with me to the end, and I'll hopefully be back soon with another video which will not be this long, I'm sure. Cheerio for now. Bye-bye.